Okay, the next chapter we're going to cover, chapter 23, is the evolution of populations. Okay, the smallest unit of evolution is, there's this concept that organisms can change during their lifetime. It takes a long time for evolution to occur. It doesn't happen in a short period of time. Well, it could if they reproduce quickly, but in general, evolution takes a while. Okay, remember, natural selection acts on individuals, but then those individuals produce more offspring, and then eventually it changes the population. So the population is going to evolve, but the actual natural selection occurs on the individuals. Okay, one example we're going to talk about is the medium ground finches. Daphne Major Island is one of the Galapagos. Okay, and so what happened was there was a drought and there wasn't a lot of food, and so the birds with the large beaks that could crack open large seeds, they survived because they could eat. The ones that couldn't get those seeds open died. Okay, so the finch population evolved by natural selection. Okay, they got rid of the ones that could not open up those large seeds, perished, they died. And so the only ones that carried on were the large beaked birds. And so eventually the population got to the point where they all had the large beaks. But again, it started with natural selection, it started with individual. Okay, so when you have a microevolution, it's a change in allele frequencies. Okay, so in other words, if there was a frequency of 50-50 blue eyes and brown eyes, but then the blue-eyed people were kind of all isolated in an area, pretty soon you would change the frequency of the blue eyes. Now maybe 100% would have blue eyes. Okay, so there's three mechanisms that can change the allele frequency. The first one, natural selection. Again, the strong, the one with whatever the allele is, they survive, where the other ones with the contrasting allele pass, they don't make it. Okay, there's also genetic drift and there's gene flow. All right, so these are the things that can change the allele frequency. When you change the frequency of a trait, then it's going to happen in a population, but it occurs over generations. It doesn't occur like tomorrow. Okay, so only natural selection causes adaptive evolution. All right, again, they're adapting to the environment and they have a better chance of survival. Okay, so when you're looking at genetic variation, this is how evolution is possible, because you have different characteristics. Not all of them are the same. So variation is a heritable trait. In other words, you can inherit it, and it is a prerequisite for evolution. In other words, if it's something you can't inherit, then it's not gonna work for evolution. So when Mendel worked on pea plants, he provided evidence that there were genes. He didn't know there were genes. He didn't know about DNA, and he didn't know that, but he knew that there was something that carried on so that you inherited certain traits. And eventually they were called genes. Okay. Well, when you get genetic variation among individuals, it's caused by differences in the genes. Okay. So we all have genes for certain characteristics, but they're different according to what we got from our parents. Okay. Again, brown eyes and blue eyes, dark hair, light hair, curly hair, going bald. There's so many characteristics, and we have this variation. And again, this is caused by our genes. Again, we talked about phenotype. Phenotype is what you look like. Okay, so the gene, maybe you have, like I have type O blood. Okay, my genotype is OO. The blood type is OO. And my phenotype was actually having blood type O. Okay, so phenotype is a product of inherited genotype. All right, you get your phenotype from your genes. Genes is what the genes say, phenotype is what you look like. Okay, natural selection can only act on a variation in a genetic component. Again, with the birds, with their beaks. Okay, the ones that had the bigger beaks were the ones that survived. That was a variation in a genetic component. Okay, some phenotype differences are determined by a single gene. Some can be classified as either or. It depends on, we also have environmental issues taking place, but most are influences by two or more genes. Blood type, we have A, we have B, and then if you don't get either, you get O. Okay. When it comes to like your height, if height was just short or tall, we'd either all be short or all be tall. But now we have variations. We have people in between. We have medium height. So there's more than one gene that controls our height. So depending on how many of those genes determines how tall you will be. I'm sorry. Okay, so genetic variation can be measured as gene variability or nucleotide variability, okay? If we have various genes and they cause different zygosity, it just means if you have two different genes. It measures the average percent of loci. In other words, they measure the distance, and they measure how many people have or are heterogeneous in a population. And again, when you're doing work with genetics, it's really hard to work with people because you got to look at what's out there and take that information. It's not like plants where like Mendel could breed tons and tons and tons and tons of pea plants because they were pea plants, but you can't do that with people. Okay, so anyway, they look at the various by measuring the DNA sequences. And again, you're going to have more variants the longer the gene is. Okay, so when you have a nucleotide variant, so you have a change in the DNA in a nucleotide, it rarely results in something different in the phenotype. It's in the genes, but usually you have a dominant recessive, and usually the dominant will take care of it. Okay, some phenotype variation does not result from genetic differences from individuals, but instead from the environment. Okay, and there's a big debate on this. You can take twins which have the exact same DNA, but if they're growing, if they're separated and they grow in two different environments, they can be totally different individuals. Well, if they have the same genetics, how can they be so different? Well, they might look the same, but they'll act different because there's environmental influences. Okay, so only genetic determined variation can be a part of the evolution. If it's something with the environment, that's different. Okay, so when we're talking about changes in evolution in populations, it's in the genes. Okay, so what causes genetic variation? There's new genes and alleles that can rise from mutation. Okay, once that, when you change the DNA, you have a mutation. A lot of times mutations are actually deadly, but not always. A birthmark can be a mutation. And sometimes we have gene duplication. Okay, we've talked about crossing over and things like that. Okay, sexual reproduction can result in genetic variation. That is one of the highlights of the sexual reproduction versus asexual. Asexual, the individuals are exactly like the parent they came from. Well, if they're okay for the environment, that's fine. You can produce a lot of offspring that way. But what if they're not? What if they need to make a change? Sexual reproduction allows that change. Okay, so when you get a new allele, when it's not the same as the parents, it's different. It's a mutation, and what can happen is there's a random change in the nucleotide sequence. Instead of being AAA, maybe it's ACA. Okay, and if it does that, remember, you're going to have a different protein because you're going to have a different amino acid brought up by the codons and the anticodons in the RNA. Only mutations in a cell that can produce gametes can be passed to the offspring. So if there's a mutation in a body cell, that's not going to be passed on. The mutations have to occur in the gametes because that's how it would be passed on. Okay, a point mutation is a change in one base. So in other words, instead of A, now there's a C or a G or something like that. Okay, that's a point mutation. And you might think, well, what's one nucleotide when you have all those? Well, think about it. If the gene sequence or the amino acids come from that, from the DNA, from the code, if you change one, you change a bunch of amino acids down the line. Okay, so the effects of a point mutation can vary. Okay, they can result in a change in protein production. And most of the time, when you have a mutation and you have a different protein, it's usually harmful. Usually. Not always, but usually. Okay? Harmful mutations can be hidden. Because if you have a dominant and a recessive, and the recessive has the mutation, it's covered up. Okay? Mutations can result in a change in a protein production. Sometimes, not always, not very often, but sometimes it can be beneficial. Okay? The effect of point mutations can vary. It depends on point mutation in a non-coding region. In you have a lot of DNA that's just, it doesn't code for anything. It's just there. So if you have a point mutation in that part, it's not going to do anything because it didn't code for a protein. Doesn't matter. So there's no advantage or disadvantage when that happens. And most of the time, you're not going to know what happened. Okay, mutations to genes can be neutral because there is a redundancy in the genetic code. Let's say you have a mutation and you have another part that covers it up. So, it doesn't affect you in any way. If the chromosome number or chromosome mutations, now you're talking about a big chunk of genes, okay? If you have a deletion, if you have like a translocation, we talked about all of these when we talked about chromosomes. Those usually are harmful, okay? Because now you're messing with a lot of proteins, not just one gene, you're messing with several, okay? If you have a duplication of a small piece of DNA, and then it makes the genome size bigger. In other words, instead of having 46 full chromosomes, you have 46 and a little other piece. Usually not a big deal. It can cause some characteristics like, maybe some proteins are missing or something like that, but usually it's not too bad. When you have but when it's duplicated, then it can cause other mutations. Okay, so maybe that piece breaks off and attaches to another one, and then you end up with more. And, there's all kinds of things that can happen. Basically, you need 46 full, complete chromosomes, and messing with them is going to cause problems. Okay, there's one, an odor detecting gene that had been duplicated many times. We have about 350 copies. Mice have 1,000 copies. Dogs, I think they say, have like 10,000. They smell better than we do, okay? And I don't mean like we need deodorant. I mean, they have a better sense of smell than we do, okay? So that can happen. Okay, mutation rates are low in animals and plants. If you're looking at average of a mutation, an average is about one mutation in every 100,000 genes per generation. It's not very much, is it? But again, we have a lot of people, people born with mutations, and we don't, I think, well, they're generally pretty rare. Excuse me. Mutation rates are often lower in prokaryotes and higher in viruses, okay? So prokaryote would be like bacteria. They usually don't have a ton of. It's not good, because if you get a mutation in a bacteria, what is it going to mutate to? Is it going to be, a harmless bacteria now becomes harmful, so you don't want a lot of messing around with the bacteria. Okay, mutations accumulate quickly in prokaryotes and viruses because they have such a short generation time. Okay, bacteria usually reproduce every 20 minutes. So if you want to follow one, it's easy to work with the bacteria because you can see a lot of generations in a day, okay? When viruses, remember, a virus can't live unless it's inside of a living cell. But again, they have short generation times once they get into a living cell. Okay, so we know that sexual reproduction is important to changes to evolution. Okay, sexual reproduction can shuffle existing alleles into new combinations. Okay, in organisms that reproduce sexually, recombination of alleles is more important than a mutation. So you get more changes from a recombination of alleles than you do from mutations, okay? If you're passing on a tall gene and you have some short people in the population, but yet they reproduce with tall people, then you're, moving that short out of there and you're making more and more individuals taller, okay? So you can actually calculate this. It's called the Hardy-Weinberg equation, and you can test whether a population is evolving. What you need to do is you have to look at the population and clarify what you mean by a population. So how many people are you talking about? What individuals are you talking about? Beetles? Are you talking about flies? Whatever. And then you have to look at your gene pool and the frequency of the allele already. So you're going to take a population, a local group of individuals capable of interbreeding. Again, you don't want to do this with people. And then producing fertile offspring. So usually this is going to happen with plants, bugs, bacteria, whatever. The gene pool consists of all the alleles for all the loci in a population, so on a certain spot, okay? And the locus is fixed in individuals in a population that are homozygous for the same allele, okay? Well, you know what? We're going to quit here because I am going to run out of time.